New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Scott Sorrell. Today, we're coming to you live from Reno, Nevada at the Western Dairy Management Conference. Dr. Mike Brook from Kansas State has put together a really nice speaker lineup, but if you're missing this year's event, don't despair, because we're going to be recording several podcasts with the speakers over the next 3 days, and we'll be releasing those on our regular Real Science Exchange podcast platform over the next few weeks. But today, let's get on to the main event. Today, we welcome Dr. Geoffrey Dahl from the University of Florida to share his insights into heat stress as warmer weathers will soon be arriving. Now, that's not true here in Reno. It was snowing like crazy yesterday, but don't despair. It'll be here sooner than later. Dr. Geoffrey Dahl is the Harriet B. Weeks Professor in the Department of Animal Sciences and Director of the USID Feed and Future Livestock Systems Innovation Lab at the University of Florida. He grew up on a dairy farm in Massachusetts and received his BS in animal science from the University of Massachusetts. Jeff completed his MS in the dairy science at Virginia Tech and earned his PhD in animal science from Michigan State. He then spent 3 years as a postdoc fellow in the reproductive science program at the University of Michigan before joining the faculty at the University of Maryland. At Maryland, he served as associate professor and undergrad program coordinator in the Department of Animal and Avian Science. Prior to his current appointment, Dr. Dahl served as the professor and extension dairy specialist in the Department of Animal Sciences at the University of Illinois. He's an active member of ADSA and served as a member and chair of industry award committees and boards. Jeff served as the ADSA representative to Co-Farm from 2005 to 2008 and currently serves as the production division secretary. He has been a member of the Journal of Dairy Science editorial board since 2001, and he became the physiology and management section editor in 2008. So with that, Dr. Dahl, welcome back to the Real Science Lecture Series. The floor is now yours.
Thanks a lot, Scott. I really appreciate the opportunity to bring forward some of the newer work that we've been doing around heat stress, both in lactating cows and also the work that we've been heavily involved in for the last 15, 18 years, looking at the impacts of heat stress during the dry period, both on the cow and then also on that calf as it goes through early life events and then actually enters the string and is programmed for a different phenotype when she experiences heat stress in utero. So just to give you an idea of the sorts of topics I'm going to cover today, as I said, newer research that we've done with lactating animals looking at some of the impacts of heat stress, not only on productivity, but on efficiency. And that, of course, leads to questions about greenhouse gas outputs, particularly methane output, and what the impacts of heat stress are on that. And then I'm going to review some of the work that's been done looking at the impact during late gestation in the dry cow, obviously on her milk yield in the next lactation, but some of our newer efforts around placental function and how that may impact both the cow and also the calf, and then a study that we did with animals that had yet to have a calf. So those nulliparous, those first calf heifers, and what happens when they're heat stressed late in gestation. And then finally, we'll talk about some in utero programming of that calf who experiences heat stress during the end of their gestation, and then sort of bring it all back to longevity effects, where we think that some of these impacts can be affecting our animals long-term and our herd long-term. So just to get started with some information on the lactating cow, I mean, we know that there are impacts of heat stress on animals during lactation, and the cows are going to be affected by heat stress by reducing their output. And this is illustrated pretty clearly here in some data that we took from Florida DHIA records, looking at production per cow per month on average. Older data, but I'm sure the pattern persists. What we see is there's a peak in productivity on a per cow basis, again in the early spring, March and April, and the low point occurs out here in September or October when we see those animals decline in productivity on average. And if we then plot against that the average temperature that those animals are exposed to, it becomes pretty clear that as heat increases, as we get to June, July, August, we see a decline in productivity. And so that's illustrating some of the effects, the direct effects of animals when they're in lactation. But then, of course, we see this decline really persist through the early months of the fall. And that's what led us to look at some of the impacts on dry cows that I'll share with you in a few slides. When we look at the impacts on dry cows, those animals are going to have impact in the next lactation where their milk yield is going to be affected. We've looked at numerous effects on metabolism, on immune function, on placental function, as I'll share with you in a few slides. And then we'll also talk about impacts on the calf, because we know that heat stress in those animals during late gestation are going to be negatively influenced. So just to give some context for the types of studies that we're doing and where we do these studies, this is an illustration or a photo of the barn that we use for most of our studies. You can see it's pretty common to have this arrangement in the southeast where we're located, obviously. The sand-bedded free stalls, in this case, it's a 4-row barn. Many of our barns are going to be 6-row barns, but they'd all be open-sided. We'd have fans over the beds, as illustrated here, and then soaker lines over the feed line here. And so those animals are going to get soaked at the feed line and then come back to the beds, hopefully, and the movement of air by those fans is going to pull some of that water off their backs and with it heat and actively cool those animals. Now, in our case, we run a pretty standard sort of on-off series. We have our fans come on at about 70 degrees, 21 degrees C, and the soakers come on for 1 minute every 5 minutes at about 22 degrees Celsius. So I show this not only to kind of give you an idea where we do these studies, but also to just give you a little bit more, I think it adds a little more validation to what we're doing because, as I said, this is kind of a common arrangement in the Southeast. So I think that this would be common for most of the facilities that I've seen in North America, many of them in South America and elsewhere. So it, I think, provides some confirmation of the validity of what we're talking about, not only in the research setting, but also in the production setting. So when we don't cool animals late in gestation, we see a significant reduction in milk yield in those cows as they move through the lactation cycle. So these are data from one of our studies showing this response. The solid symbols are animals that were cooled during late gestation, and we're comparing those to a group of animals in the open symbols that were heat stressed during late gestation. So the animals that are cooled are producing about 10 pounds a day more than the animals that were heat stressed, and that was really the only difference in how these cows were managed. There were no differences in the animals' management once they were in lactation. They were all actively cooled. They were all fed the same diet. They calved around the same time. So really the only difference was what we did with these animals during the dry period. And the cows that were heat stressed had an elevated temperature of roughly 0.4 of a degree Celsius or about a degree Fahrenheit. Not a severe heat stress, but a significant heat stress in those animals for the entire dry period. So not so unusual if we were to say put animals out on pasture in the summertime, particularly in Florida, but in other areas as well. Those animals could see that level of heat stress pretty realistically. So that's one study. Obviously, we want to see that confirmed. And these are most of the studies. There are a couple that have not included yet, just have not updated this slide, but they all show the same sort of response. The solid bars are the cows that are cooled in the study versus the cows that were heat stressed during the dry period. And again, when we put all this together, it's about a 8-pound-a-day difference in overall productivity of the cows that are cooled versus those animals that are heat stressed during late gestation. So pretty profound response of these animals to that late gestation heat stress. If we look at animals then that are dry in the cool months, versus animals that are dry in the hot months, that's a way to get an idea of what other influences this heat stress may have during late gestation. So we can't really take the number of animals and cool them or heat stress them to look at some of these disease outcomes, to look at reproductive outcomes. So we really had to compare, in this case, animals in different times of the year, that were dry in different times of the year, yet managed similarly. And so to do this, we looked at records of a large dairy that we work with quite often, and sort of divided records from cows, ones that had their entire 60-day dry period during the hottest months of the year in Florida, June, July, August, and compared it to records of cows in that same herd, managed under the same conditions, same diet, everything else, but were dry during the coolest months of the year, December, January, and February. So pretty similar numbers of animals, perhaps a few more that were dry in the hottest months of the year, which is another reason that we need to address this in all situations, because we probably got more cows that are going to potentially be heat stressed during the dry period in most herds, given sort of seasonal influences on calving. But we saw that there was this impact on milk production. About 1,100 pounds more on that lactation for the animals that were dry during the cool months relative to the animals that were dry during the hottest months of the year. And then when we looked at incidence of disease, mastitis, 0 means the cows didn't have it, 1 means they did. We saw that there was an increase in mastitis in the cows dry during the hotter months of the year. There's an increase in respiratory disease. There was an increase in retained membranes in those cows as well, relative to the cows that were dry during the cooler months of the year. In fact, the only disease that we measured that broadly, at least as a disease, was digestive diseases, which included ketosis. And so those animals were on a protocol where they're going to get a keto stick every kind of week after the animals calved in. We think we had a little bit more positives in the animals that were dry during the cooler months of the year, but that was consistent with that higher level of milk production, perhaps a little more mobilization of body reserves. But of course, that didn't cause any sort of subsequent increase in disease or for other sort of acquired diseases in those animals, because they were at a lower percentage of disease incidence for all the other ones we looked at. So overall, consistent with our work, not only on the production side, but also we've done quite a bit looking at specific sort of influences on the immune system, and that lower disease incidence is consistent with that. So then if we look at animals that are dry during the cool months and their reproductive performance. Here again, cows that are dry when it's hot are going to have poorer reproduction in that next lactation relative to animals that are dry during the cool season. So this is really reflected in the animals that when we look at the days in milk until they were bred, and the days in milk to pregnancy, particularly important. Those animals that were dry during the cooler months actually became pregnant sooner than the ones dry during the hotter months. And if you think about it, they were probably being bred during the hotter months of the year relative to the animals that were dry during the hotter months. So if anything, this is a pretty conservative estimate of the actual influence on reproductive performance, and consistent with some of the other work that we've done subsequently to look at reproductive performance. So a couple of questions that had come up from some of our earlier work, do you have to cool animals for the entire dry period to see this response? And what about if we were going to cool heifers before they've actually had that first calf? Will there be any positive outcomes to that from either the cow or the calf standpoint? So we've looked at this in a couple of ways recently. First one, in terms of how much of the dry period do we need to cool these cows for? We set up our kind of normal model where cows were either put on heat stress or cooling treatment as soon as they dried off. And so we saw when those animals were on heat stress treatment that their rectal temperature increased and their respiration rate increased. So if you look at panel A and panel B, you see increases in the open symbols. Those are the cows that were heat stressed for the first part of the dry period. And then about halfway through the dry period, in this case, we were targeting roughly 6 to 7 weeks of dry period. So those animals were about 21 to 24 days into the dry period. We took half of each of those original groups and we switched them to the other treatment. So we ended up with 4 total groups of animals for the study. We had cows that were cooled for the entire dry period. We had cows that were heat stressed for the entire dry period. We had cows that were cooled the first half of the dry period and then heat stressed as parturition approached. And then we had cows that were heat stressed for the first part of the dry period and then finally cooled for the last half or so of that dry period. And we saw what we expected with regard to rectal temperature and respiration rate. The animals that went from cooling to heat stress increase in rectal temperature as shown in panel C, and then panel D just shows the respiration rate increasing in those animals as well when they went from cooling to heat stress, and the cows that went from heat stress to cooling declined in both of those variables. So what was of interest, though, was we didn't quite see the responses that we expected in some other variables. So we know that when cows are heat stressed late in gestation, there's going to be a reduction in their gestation length. The cows tend to calve in 3 to 4 days earlier when they're heat stressed relative to those animals that are cooled. And that's shown here on the left panel. The cows that are in blue were the cool treatment for the entire dry period, and they calved later than the animals that were heat stressed. So we had about a 3 or 4 day reduction. That then led to a longer dry period in the animals that were cooled for the entire time versus the animals that were heat stressed. What was of interest was the animals that were in the switch groups both essentially reacted the same way. They also had a shorter gestation length and a shorter dry period length than the animals that were cooled for the entire time. And it wasn't any different from the animals that were heat stressed for the entire time. So we'll talk about this more in a minute, but this is more reflective, I think, of an influence on placental function in those animals that are heat stressed. So any heat stress during the dry period appears to have some negative impacts on placental function, and that then can subsequently not only influence the calf, but influence the cow as well. And the reason for that is that when we look at the placenta, it's not just there for calf sort of development and support. It's also there to provide hormones that can influence mammary development late in gestation. So here's an older study showing the impacts of heat stress, in this case, no shade in the summer in Florida versus shade in the summer in Florida, and the influence on estrone sulfate, which is going to be secreted by the placenta. And we see that animals that are more heat stressed in the no shade group have lower estrone sulfate concentrations than animals that were under shade. So that's consistent with an effect on hormones that can have an influence on mammary development during that time of late gestation. Some additional information that we've generated more recently is looking at pregnancy-specific protein B, so one of the PAGs. We see that cows that are heat stressed in late gestation have lower concentration of the PAGs relative to animals that are cooled. So both of those are reflecting not only a reduction in hormone output from the placenta, but also an indication of some dysfunction of that placenta as well. And we think now that that's probably where kind of the nexus of these effects on the cow and the calf that we're going to talk about in a few minutes are occurring. And in fact, if we look at just sort of gross indications of placental function, we've actually looked at the number of cotyledons in cows that are heat stressed late in gestation versus animals that are cooled, and we see that there's a dramatic reduction in the cotyledon number, so kind of an indication of overall placental function and activity in those animals when they're heat stressed versus animals that are cooled. And this picture kind of illustrates that. Those trays are the exact same size. What we're comparing here are animals that were either heat stressed in that left photo or in the sort of double photo, that's an animal that was cooled late in gestation. And it illustrates that there's a significant impact on placental function in the animals when they're heat stressed in late gestation. And this subsequently, when we come back to that switch study, shows up in their productivity in that next lactation. So the top open squares there are the animals that were cooled for the entire dry period. And we compared that to the open circles, which are the animals that were heat stressed for the entire time. See our effect. The cows that are cooled, more milk than the cows that are heat stressed the entire time. Those solid symbols there then that are tracking with the animals that were heat stressed the entire time are both of the switch groups. So it looked like at first there may be some influence and some reduction in the sort of drag on productivity that we see with heat stress, but ultimately those animals did not produce any more milk than the cows that had been heat stressed for the entire time. And so to get back to our original question, what we interpret that as is meaning that those cows that are heat stressed during the dry period at any time are going to have a significant drag on their productivity for that next lactation. So then what about first calf heifers? They don't have a dry period. They're just going into their first lactation. Are they able to overcome these effects of heat stress? Well, to look at that, we set up a study where animals came off of pasture about 2 months before they were due to calve in. They were put into a freestall barn with access to, in the case of the cooling animals, soakers and fans, and the animals that were our heat stress group were just like our normal older cow studies where they just, fans and soakers were turned off. So all they had was shade in that barn. And you see that there was a separation in terms of the respiration rate in panel A and the rectal temperature in panel B. The cows that were heat stressed continued to have higher respiration rates throughout that sort of pre-calving period and continued to have elevated rectal temperatures through that pre-calving period as well, relative to the heifers that were in our cooling treatment. And then when we looked at milk yield, the animals that had been cooled produced about 7 pounds a day more milk than the animals that were heat stressed for that 60 days prior to that first lactation. So the same response that we see in the older cows going through a dry period, those animals that were coming into their first lactation were also benefited by cooling late in gestation in terms of their yield in that first lactation. So sort of summing up the effects on those cows as they come through the dry period, when they've been heat stressed late in gestation, there's a negative influence on yield, some metabolic dysfunction. There's certainly immune challenges in those animals, and we think a lot of it relates to those effects on placental function that we've just started to look at more recently. And potentially that'll be a mechanism that we can go after to try and improve upon some of these effects. But now let's sort of switch gears and take a look at influences on the calf and some of the more recent work that's been done looking at the long-term programming impacts of heat stress and late gestation on those calves. In terms of some of the first data that we generated looking at this, birth weight of calves is going to be reduced when their dam is heat stressed late in gestation relative to those that are cooled. Not so much new here. This has been known for a long time, but we see this readily apparent in the animals that are coming from heat stressed dams versus those coming from cooled dams. Perhaps more important is the impact on passive immune function. We see that cooling late in gestation actually improves the capacity for immunoglobulin uptake relative to animals that are born to a heat-stressed dam. So here we have data from one of the first studies that we did with this, looking at total IgG in the animals that were from a cooled dam versus a heat-stressed dam. They all got the same volume of colostrum. There wasn't a difference in colostrum quality as indicated by the concentration of IgG in those colostrum volumes that were given to the animals. They were all tubed, so we know they got the colostrum that we wanted them to get. And yet we see for the first day and then on through the first month of life, those calves that are from a cooled dam actually have higher circulating IgG relative to the ones that are from a heat stress dam. So there's some influence on their ability to absorb IgG with heat stress that we don't see in the animals that are cooled. Of course, we didn't know exactly what this might be because despite the fact that the IgG concentrations weren't different in the colostrum, perhaps there was something else that was influencing the animal's ability to take up colostrum if she was from a heat stress dam versus a cooled dam. And ultimately, we've gone on to show that it wasn't so much of an effect on colostrum itself, but it was an effect on the calf. And what we've illustrated here on that right panel is just a histological section of the jejunum from a calf that was heat stressed in utero. And when we compare that to animals that are cooled in utero, what we see is that there's a much more rapid onset of gut closure in the animals that were heat stressed versus those animals that were cooled. And so gut closure obviously is going to seal off the capacity for those animals to take up immunoglobulin. And that's exactly what we see when we track those calves through the first month of life. So there's an impact of late gestation heat stress on the development of the immune system and in the capacity to take up immunoglobulin that negatively influences that calf's potential moving into the growth and then into the lactation strain. So one of our first stabs at looking at some of these downstream effects was taking data from a number of studies that we had done and combining it to get enough numbers to really start to look at some of these indicators of survival and also productivity into that first lactation. Then we've looked at it further beyond as well. So in this first study, we had about 40 heifers from cooled dams, compared them with about 40 animals from heat stress dams overall. Since gone on, as I said, to look at larger numbers of animals in each of these groups, but the responses have remained the same. So as I said, when animals are born to a heat stress dam, they're born at a lower birth weight. We had subsequently shown that those animals have lower weight at weaning, so that sort of growth lag persists in animals that have been heat stressed in utero, and it even persists if we look out to a year of age, around the time of puberty. Those animals still are of a significantly lower body weight than their herd mates that were born to a cooled dam. So this is kind of the first indication that there are some of these long-lasting effects on those animals of in utero heat stress that may then be producing a different phenotype, certainly for growth, but also for survival and productivity later on. So when we looked at survival in these animals, we found that there was, in fact, a lower number of animals that were born to a heat stress dam making it through puberty versus the animals that were born to a cooled dam. And then, of course, that led to fewer animals making it through the first lactation if they were born to a heat stress dam versus a cooled dam. So a significant influence is on calf survival of that in utero heat stress relative to cooling. It also decreased their reproductive performance. Again, this was one of our first looks at this, and I've got some other data that I'll share with you that sort of confirms this and shows really what the sort of physiological implications are of this heat stress late in gestation on those animals' reproductive performance. But just illustrated here is that the calves that were born to a heat stress dam, it took them more services to get pregnant. Their age of pregnancy was increased. So those animals actually had poorer reproductive performance than the animals that were born to a cooled dam. And now looking at that from a sort of physiologic perspective in a more recent study, these are data from an experiment that was done looking at anti-Müllerian hormone concentrations and reproductive organ development. We actually did a slaughter study. Calves were sacrificed either at birth or at weaning. And you see that anti-Müllerian hormone, which is an indicator of the follicular reserve and the capacity for subsequently reproductive performance, is reduced in the animals that were born to a heat stress dam relative to those that were born to a cooled dam. So here's a strong indication that those animals are going to have poorer reproductive outcomes if they're heat stressed in utero versus those animals that were cooled. And perhaps more clearly illustrated is the influence on ovarian development. Calves that are born to a cooled dam, significantly greater ovarian mass. Any way you kind of looked at it at either birth or at, not so much as birth, but also at puberty, at weaning, excuse me. So that bottom sort of row of variables there, looking at ovarian length, width, volume, ovarian weight, all of those significantly greater in the animals that were born to a cooled dam, shown here in the top panel photograph, versus animals that were born to a heat stress dam. Those grids are exactly the same size, yet it clearly illustrates that there is less volume. Ovarian size is compromised with in utero heat stress. And of course, these animals, after they were born, were all managed identically from the time of birth through slaughter at weaning. So there was really nothing that would explain this that happened to the animals after they were born. This was due to that heat stress that they experienced late in gestation. And that same influence affects the animal's mammary development, so another reproductive organ. What we have here are mammary sections from the animals that were either heat stressed or cooled in utero. We see even at birth, you can visually see that the animals sort of mammary parenchyma, their overall capacity for mammary development is reduced if they were heat stressed here in the sort of purple line versus the animals that were cooled, that line in the teal color. And that persists at the time of weaning. So we had greater mammary development in the animals that were cooled in utero versus the animals that were heat stressed. And when we look at it at the sort of cellular level, it's even more apparent. The animals that are heat stressed in utero have lesser capacity for proliferation of mammary epithelial and also stromal cells. That occurs not only in the animals at the time of birth, but also that persists at weaning. So, the animals are going to have lesser capacity for mammary development, which ultimately we think is responsible for the reduction that we see in lactation output in the first lactation those animals experience, but also later on. And that's illustrated here when we look at the first lactation yield of calves that were born either to a heat stress dam in the open symbols or calves that were born to a cooled dam in the solid symbols. There is a significant reduction in that first lactation milk yield if she experienced heat stress late in gestation versus her herd mates that were cooled or born to cooled dams. So that reduction in mammary development, that influence on other reproductive organs, probably having that influence on the animal's capacity for mammary output as well. What we don't see ultimately is a difference in body weight. So that's not explaining these differences in productivity. Even though there was a difference in birth weight, weaning weight, and weight at about a year of age, by the time those animals calved in that first lactation, they had caught up. So they didn't calve at a different weight. So that's not really explaining the difference that we have here. So the animals that are heat stressed in utero just have influences on not only their overall development, but also on specific organs then that are going to influence their productivity later in life and also potentially influence their immune system. And we've subsequently gone on to look at records from animals, not just in that first lactation, but in the second lactation, in the third lactation, as you see illustrated in panel B and C. And it's the same story. That first lactation drag is going to persist in the second lactation, and it really becomes even more apparent in that third lactation. Of course, we're also going to see other differences in terms of survival of animals that I'll show you in the next slide that probably contribute to this magnification of the response. Nevertheless, it's a significant impact on their productivity if they were heat stressed in utero versus those animals that are cooled in utero. And just to illustrate the effects on herd survival, panel A are the calves that were born to heat stressed or cooled dams. So these are what we term the F1 animals out of our heat stress versus cooled dams during the dry period. You can see that the heat stressed animals, about a year less time in the herd than animals that were cooled in utero. So that's reflecting differences in reproductive performance, in growth, in disease acquisition, and in productivity. But when we talk about the phenotype, then not only being in those animals, but transgenerationally sort of transmitted, we look at the animals in panel B. These are the granddaughters of those original cows that were heat stressed or cooled. And here we see a similar pattern of herd survival. The ones whose dams were cooled in utero last in the herd longer than the ones that were heat stressed in utero. So potential overall effect on these animals, not only individual performance, but what they pass on to their offspring as well, which is really sort of a good illustration of fetal programming events. influences and insults during gestation in that in uterine environment that then persist in those animals, and they can pass it on to their offspring as well. So given all of these negative impacts, we wanted to look at the potential for affecting longevity overall. Now, as I just illustrated, it looked like in our controlled studies that those animals that were born to a heat stress dam are not going to last as long in the herd. But in order to really get at the numbers that we needed to look at longevity, we took a little different approach to this. So we had some herds in Florida, a herd in Florida, and a couple of herds in California that we had excellent records from over a long time period. And we simply asked the question, what happens in terms of animals that are in their 5th or greater lactation if they are born in the cool season versus those animals born in the hot season? So these are cows that are in their 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th lactation. And we looked at their records and we saw that the animals that were in those higher lactations disproportionately were born in the coolest season of the year. So in this case, it was December, January, February. And we compared it then, or saw that the animals that were born in the hottest months of the year, sort of that June, July, August time period, we had only about 30% versus 70% that were born in the cool season. So definitely an indication that we're going to have an effect of season of birth on those animals' persistence in the herd. And so we take this back to, an effect of heat stress in those animals affecting their longevity as well. You can see that we had significant heat stress because in Florida, our average THI was about 77. Our cool season, it was much lower, 58 or so. Then looking at the California herd, THI a little lower in the hot season, cooler in the cool season, but we see a similar pattern, not quite as apparent, but significant nonetheless. Over half, so 56% of the animals that were born in the cool season actually made it through these higher lactation numbers, whereas 44% of the animals made it to those higher lactation numbers if they were born in the hottest season of the year. So not potentially the extremes of heat stress that we see in the situation that we have in Florida with high heat and humidity, but a similar pattern suggesting that there is this long-term influence on overall productivity and longevity in the herd based on the season that the animals were born in. And we attribute this obviously to significant impacts or relevance to heat stress effects on those animals late in gestation. In terms of why the animals left the herd, well, they were all the sort of normal reasons: breeding issues, feet and leg issues, mastitis. So all the sort of influences that you would expect to see for animals to be removed from the herd over time, all of them increased if the calves were born in the hot season versus the animals that were born in a cooler season. When we looked at that in California, it actually seemed to alter their death loss. So in California, more of the animals that were born in the hot season were actually death loss rather than being sold from the herd. So there again, another significant impact potentially financially of these animals being born in the hot season without cooling versus the animals being born in the cool season. So overall, we think that birth season is going to affect animal longevity, and it's something to look at and manage if we want to improve longevity within our herd. Looks like cows that are born in the cooler season or under cooler conditions have increased longevity when we look at the time that they spent in the herd, and the cows that are born in the hot season, they're going to be sold or they're going to die sooner than the animals that were born in the cooler season. So one way that we can manage longevity or have more influence on longevity is make sure that those animals are cooled late in gestation. So with that, just to end up, these influences that we see, dry period heat stress persist, not only in the cow for that lactation, but also in the offspring, and she can pass that on to her offspring as well. And we think that a lot of this is coming from the impacts of heat stress on the placenta. That's signaling both the mammary gland and also the calf for a different phenotype, one of lower productivity in the cow for the next lactation, and one of lower productivity but also survival of those calves for their entire lifespan, and they pass that on to their offspring as well. And some of the slides that I got missed out, if I could just give a quick summary of what we were seeing. When we look at influences of heat stress during lactation, we see differences in how animals respond not only to heat stress, but more importantly to how that effect persists. And what that means is the stage of lactation has a significant influence on whether cows recover from that heat stress well or not. Early lactation, late lactation, it appears that animals can recover back to where we would have expected them to be from a production standpoint. It's the mid-lactation animals that take the most severe hit, and those animals never recover during that lactation. So there's definitely an influence and an interaction of stage of lactation and heat stress on those animals' productivity for that lactation. So we want to think about that if we have to limit cooling of animals at any time during, and which animals we cool. The other newer information that I had to share with you was the effect of heat stress on methane output. And quickly, what we can say is that when animals are heat stressed during lactation, there's obviously a decrease in the dry matter intake of those animals. There's a decrease in their milk output. Now that means that the cows that are heat stressed actually produce less methane than the cows that are cooled. But if we're just looking at straight methane output, I don't think that that's the right comparison. What we want to look at is those animals' yield and intensity. So what kind of methane they produce per the amount of dry matter they've consumed, what kind of influence we have on the amount of methane that they produce per unit of milk output. And in both cases, those are increased. So they are poorer performance in the animals that are heat stressed versus those animals that are cooled. Now, that has been modeled recently. There was a paper in JDS last year showing those effects as potentially the outcomes that we would see based on animal modeling. We've now looked at that directly and measured it directly and confirmed that those animals that are heat stressed during lactation have poorer efficiency and actually have an increase in the amount of methane output per unit of productivity. So with that, Scott, I'll turn it back over to you. We'll see if we have any questions, and happy to try and answer those. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Dahl. Before we get started with the Q&A portion, we'd like to share a brief video, then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
The heat of summer is coming, and it can have a big impact on your cows. NiaSure precision-release niacin is the perfect complement to traditional heat abatement strategies to help keep her cool from the inside. Using Balchem's proprietary encapsulation process, NiaSure delivers 8 times more bioavailability than raw niacin, leading to an increase in sweating and vasodilation to reduce internal body temperature and support maximum productivity. Learn more and keep her cool from the inside.
All right, as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. Dr. Dahl, I'm going to ask the first question. You've made a great argument that heat stress has a profound impact on many biological systems in the dairy cow. And you've had the opportunity to log some time in the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, Florida, Midwest, and now you're in France. So, what's the report card? How well are we doing? And what are maybe just two obvious things that we just got to do that we're not doing today to reduce the amount of heat stress?
I think that probably the first thing we need to do is remember that just because it doesn't seem hot to us, it's not hot to that cow. We don't have a 55-gallon drum fermentation vat inside of us producing heat all the time that cow does. And so when we move from our air-conditioned house to our air-conditioned truck to our air-conditioned office, it doesn't seem so bad, but that cow gets heat stressed a long time before we do. And so I think if we keep that in mind, we will pay more attention to it, particularly in more temperate areas. Certainly in Florida, in Texas, in Arizona, we know that we've got to cool those cows, but there's a significant amount of heat stress that occurs in the upper Midwest, in the Northeast, in Europe, in other areas that we're just ignoring, I think, still. And so it depends on probably where you're at. The other thing to remember is that you can probably make just as much influence on productivity by getting those dry cows cooled as you do cooling animals during lactation. Right? So the more that we do to sort of get those animals started right, the better off we're going to be through that lactation.
All right, thank you for that. Next question comes in from Elizabeth. What is your physiological reasoning as to why early and late lactation cows can recover from heat stress, but mid-lactation cows cannot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in thinking about this, I think that it probably has something to do with the sort of progression of mammary development during the lactation cycle. So early in lactation, before we hit the peak, we're still seeing some influence on mammary development. Whereas animals that are mid-lactation, once we push the envelope and see a bigger reduction in mammary capacity, we can't recover from that. And at the end of lactation, I think it's more an effect that we're at the sort of flat part of the curve and we're just not seeing that. We're not able to tease it out as much. So we think that there's just a difference in the ability to have mammary cells persist later in mid-lactation than there are in early lactation.
All right, thank you for that. Han, first of all, wants to thank you for the brilliant talk. And then he'd like to know, is there a threshold temperature that can be found that cause the noted effects?
Well, thanks for the compliment. So rather than a threshold temperature, I think that I want to use the animal as an indicator of heat stress versus a thermometer. And the reason I say that is because we use THI, but how do we really express that from an animal perspective? We looked at respiration rate as sort of a proxy for that. And at least in the dry cow, it appears that around 60 breaths per minute is when those animals begin to get heat stressed. And as that increases, their heat stress becomes more and more profound. And I would say that there's a similar sort of effect in lactating cows as well. So that then gives us kind of an easy way to look at what level of heat stress we actually have on those animals and how they're individually able to cope with that. We can go out into the pen, we can take measurements on a few animals to give us kind of an indication of that pen. If we see average respiration rates of 65, of 70, that's a good indication that we've got animals that are heat stressed. And the higher it goes, the worse the heat stress is going to be.
All right, thank you. Next question comes in from Asan, and he'd also want to thank you for a great presentation. He says it's not clear yet why colostrum volume decreases during the fall. You have any thoughts on that? Why do colostrum volumes decrease during the fall?
Well, I think that there's a combination of environmental influences, two of which I've worked on: heat stress and photoperiodic manipulation. And what we see is that the animals that are heat stressed late in gestation are going to have a reduction in colostrum volume. What we also see is that animals that coming off the summer when they've had exposure to extended light, are going to have potentially a reduction in colostrum volume as well. And it probably goes back to some influence on prolactin physiology. So prolactin, even though its terminology or nomenclature indicates an effect on lactation, and it does, has an effect at the early lactation, it also has an influence on transfer of immunoglobulins and uptake of immunoglobulins as that colostrum is forming and being produced. And so we think that there's a difference in the sensitivity to that capacity for Ig uptake and colostrum volume production with that heat stress or with that extended photoperiod that we see in animals coming off of the summer.
All right, thank you for that. Shameless plug here. Dr. Sabina Mann is going to be giving a presentation today here at the Western Dairy Management Conference on colostrum and how to get the maximize colostrum. And we're going to be recording a podcast with her later today. And so just be looking for that on the Real Science Exchange. Next question comes in from Rodrigo. Is there a confounding effect between birth season and calving season, especially for first lactation cows with age at first calving around 24 months?
Yeah, I think that there's probably some influence there. I would say that in our case, when we looked at that in our records analysis, particularly, most of those herds have good cooling when the animals calve in. And so that season of calving, may have had an influence as well, but most of that I think is due to the birth season rather than those animals' sort of season of calving. But it certainly could, be set up for a significant sort of synergistic or negative synergy on those animals if they're born in the hot months and then they're going to calve in the hot months as well.
All right, good. Phil's got an interesting question here. Was the cotyledon total surface area different between the groups, even if the total number of cotyledons were different?
Yeah, actually the cotyledon surface area was not of the individual. Well, they actually seemed a little larger in some of the cases, but we didn't see a sort of statistical difference there. But we did see a difference in surface area of the cotyledons. What's most interesting is that the dogma would be that cotyledon number is kind of established very early in pregnancy, and it doesn't change throughout the rest of pregnancy. Yet we're seeing a profound decrease in the number of cotyledons in the animals that were heat stressed versus those that were cooled. So late in gestation, we're seeing reduction in numbers. Is that fusion of cotyledons? Is it some of the cotyledons are just disappeared? We don't know that yet.
All right, another interesting question from Stuart. Is there a difference between cows that are predominantly white versus black cows in the ability to handle heat stress, more susceptible to it, especially cows that are outdoors?
Yeah, we have not looked at that specifically. I mean, we've done all of our work with Holsteins, or perhaps some of them were Holstein crosses. They were all black and white. All of our animals are inside when they're dry, so we're not able to look at that. But certainly, there's other sort of data out there showing that lighter hair coats, those animals tend to not be as negatively influenced by heat stress, or better able to deal with heat stress than animals with a darker hide. But I don't know that that's going to be enough to overcome this. And I would say that within any of those sort of hide colors, the impact of heat stress is going to be the same. If we had animals that were white and they were cooled versus heat stress, the heat stress would do worse. If they're black and they're heat stress, they're going to do worse than the animals that are black and cooled.
All right. Next question comes from Sean. Sean's living in Northern Europe, where heat stress management, according to him, is relatively poor. And in looking at your data, some heat is as bad there. Should we be cooling close-up cows in Northern Europe or using nutritional strategies?
Well, first I'd say don't just cool close-up cows. I think that our study pretty clearly showed that just cooling during the close-up period probably won't get you what you want. And so you want to look at getting those animals cooled for their entire dry period. Whether you do that through sort of fans and soakers or some of the nutritional approaches that have been used, that's kind of dependent on what you've got in terms of capacity to get those animals cooled. Whether those nutritional strategies all persist, and we've done some of that work, whether they all persist as far out in lactation as we've shown with just active cooling, we don't know, but certainly there are some factors that should have a positive influence on those animals from reduction in heat stress.
All right, and Han is circling back with another question. Soaking has been suggested as a risk factor for heat stress in more humid areas. What do you advise in that case?
I don't know exactly why it would be suggested as a risk factor other than not having appropriate ventilation to get those animals sort of dried off after they were soaked. In our case, our soakers are going to put water over the cows' backs. They're going to get soaked down to the skin, but that water is not going to really ever be sort of touching the mammary gland or anywhere else that potentially could cause issues with mastitis or elsewise. The animals are not going to be getting their stalls wet when they go and lay down. So I don't know that really is going to be a factor unless we have, like I said, poor ventilation and we're not able to get rid of that extra water vapor.
Jeff, maybe to that question, misting versus soaking, right? The difference there, right?
So misting versus soaking. Misting should be avoided. What I would say is that we want to get animals soaked to the skin. If we mist animals, we tend to set up a layer of a sort of water on the hair on the ends of the hairs, and that can actually have an insulating effect. So we do want to get them soaked to the skin in order to get them effectively cooled off from an evaporative cooling standpoint.
All right. The next question's from Phil. Based on your research, what time frame of heat stress would you estimate to be required to create the research findings? Thinking of climate where heat stress may not be constant for multiple weeks.
Yeah, I guess the way I look at it, Phil, is that any heat stress is bad. Whether we can measure it all or not, I don't know. But even if we have sort of periods of heat stress through the summer, where we would see significant elevations in temperature, say in the Northeast, in the upper Midwest, where we might have heat stress for 2 weeks, or we might have 4 or 5 days of heat stress. We know that those have impacts on lactating cows. I don't think that they have less of an impact on the dry cow and some of the things that we're seeing, except that we may not be able to sort of parse that out, except in a controlled setting. But I would say the less heat stress she experiences, the better she's going to do going into that next lactation.
All right, thank you. And I see that we have passed the top of the hour. We've got time for one more question. For those of you who haven't gotten your question, we'll try to do that during the upcoming podcast. Next question comes from Laura. Do you think the GIT issues seen in calves that were heat stress in utero would persist as that calf ages and contribute to production issues later on in life?
That's a good question. I can tell you that there is some ongoing work right now looking at gastrointestinal tract development in the older animals. We have not looked at that specifically, but there could well be influences later on as well. Just don't know the answer to that yet.
All right, very well. And with that, that's going to do it for us today, folks. Thank you, Dr. Dahl, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science Lecture Series continues with educational topic each and every month, including the next one on May 6th, titled, What's Long Enough or Too Long? Are Extended Lactations and Cow Longevity Desirable Goals? And that will take place with Dr. Stephen LeBlanc from the University of Guelph. Visit balchem.com/real science for more details on future webinars and to register for upcoming events. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform and search for Real Science Exchange or visit balchem.com/podcast. And if you want a really cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt, just subscribe to the Real Science Exchange. Give us a 5-star and a very nice comment. Send us a screenshot of that along with your address and shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. We'll get that off to you right away. With that, on behalf of Balchem and Dr. Dahl, thank you for joining us today.